This is the first segment of Crime Beat Confidential, and I'm private investigator Dana Bowman. I'm the main character in the Beyond Mystery series written by Sharon A. Crawford. The current one is Beyond Faith, and Sharon has asked me to step in at the beginning. She's running a bit late today. I don't know if it's a TTC or what, but she asked me to set the stage for her and mention her guest. But before I do that, I want to set the record straight about something, about who wrote the Beyond books. Beyond Blood, yes, she wrote it. Beyond Faith, it may say Sharon A. Crawford here, but I, Dana Bowman, I wrote the book. And, I mean, who else besides me knows what's going around in my head? Who else is being stalked by somebody or other and has to figure out who it is? Who else has a 7-year-old son, David, who's still suffering post-traumatic stress disorder from being kidnapped in Beyond Blood? He's talking now, but he just drawing these awful pictures of demons and weird-looking people. I mean, Sharon does have a son, but he's grown up now. In fact, he's my age. If you want to know what that is, you're going to have to read Beyond Faith. So I don't know why she thinks she wrote it. I wrote the book. So that's the way it is. That's the way it goes. And she's not here yet. Good. Hey, I better get down to business now. Okay. Sharon and I are both excited about this Crime Beat Confidential. This is the first segment we're doing of it. And Sharon's been on Hugh Riley's Liquid Lunch, so I don't know if this is a spawn of it or what, but she's going to be dealing with the crime area. Probably no murderers coming on, but she's going to do more than just have authors on. She's going to have a police officer. She's going to have private investigator, and she's promised me I can interview the private investigator, and also forensics. And you know, forensic is not just some forensic guy or gal showing up at a crime scene and trying to figure out what's going on with a dead body. No, there's much more with this. And our guest today, James Wigmore, who is a forensic scientist, is in a different area of crime, of forensics. It has nothing to do with dead bodies, unless they get killed in a car crash or something. But what he does is he does a lot of testifying in court, and he deals with alcohol. He's a toxicologist with that. And also something new he started with now is weed. I mean cannabis, with all the legalization of it in Canada and the States. And I want to go on the record right now that I have never in all of my life smoked weed. My twin brother, P.I. Bast Overture, did as a teenager, but I never did. I wasn't really worried about, being charged with possession or going on a bad trip or anything like that. No, I just couldn't stand the smell of the weed. That was my problem. And oh, here comes Sharon now. So I guess I have to get out of here and turn this show over to Sharon. So Sharon, over to you. Thank you, Dana. I'm not sure we needed to hear all that now, but I suppose I can put it in a future Beyond book. Speaking of books, as Dana also mentioned, my guest is James G. Widmore, who is a forensic toxicologist, scientist, but he first and foremost, but he's also an author, and he has years of experience in toxicology. First as a senior forensic scientist, Ministry of the Solicitor General, Center of Forensic Sciences, Technology section, until he retired in 2005. But in 2005, he also won an award. He was a recipient of the Denome Award for Outstanding Contribution to Forensic Science. He was the fourth one to receive this award from the Canadian Society of Forensic Sciences since 1996. And then after retiring, he went into private practice. He also wrote a couple of books. The definitive book, Wigmore on Alcohol, published by Irwin Law for legal public purposes. Now, lately, he has switched his focus on cannabis toxicology because of Canada's move to legislate the weed. And yes, he has a new book out for that. In the same vein, Wigmore on Cannabis, and also published by Irwin Law, and we will have a look-see at that book sometime during the show. So welcome to Crime Beat.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for inviting me to your show. It's great to be here.
Okay, Dana has made some allusions to forensics, and it's not just looking at dead bodies and trying to figure out what killed them. So maybe you could tell me what exactly a forensic scientist does and what the education is you need for it in order to become.
Well, I think I'll focus mainly on my field.
Sure.
Basically, the forensic science field is a huge area, and as you'll know with your show, you invite all sorts of different guests with all sorts of expertise. My expertise is forensic toxicology, and toxicology is a science of drugs and poisons and their diverse effects on the human body. So basically, as a toxicologist, we're looking at, say, post-mortem blood samples to see what caused death, or maybe alcohol was involved in the stupid action the person did by, falling off the bridge or going through the ice on a snowmobile, maybe due to alcohol. We also look at a lot of impaired driving situations. So I would say about 90% of my testimony in court was on impaired driving, especially when the impaired driver caused death in another individual. So very serious charges that can occur. And the most common drug in any criminal offenses so far is alcohol. But number two, and coming up fast, is cannabis.
So we have those two to deal with. Okay, so what education is needed?
Currently now, the basically want a PhD to begin with in some of in a science area. When I started in '76, there was no basically training for individuals. So right now there's a lot of forensic courses offered by various universities. So that would be a good start to go to forensic sciences, take some of the forensic courses, and see which area of the science of the forensic science that you would be interested in, whether it be DNA or biology, or my favorite, toxicology of drugs and alcohol, or maybe bloodstain patterns. So right now they have a lot of specialized courses that you can take and can help you if you want to choose this as a career.
What are some of the places that offer these courses?
University of Toronto, I just gave a lecture there at the Mississauga campus. They offer a forensic science course. I think Laurentian offers it. In Oshawa, Oshawa University of Technology offers a forensic science course. So they're quite extensive now because they're quite popular.
I would think so. Maybe CSI has something to do with it. I don't know. Who knows?
I think they also may get all sorts of crime writers, too, to understand the forensic science a bit.
Yeah, I guess
so they can write it into their book.
Exactly. So why did you decide to become a forensic scientist?
It was a fluke.
A fluke?
Yeah. I just, there was a job available at the forensic lab in Toronto, which is on Grosvenor Street. Right now it's moved to a much fancier location at Wilson and Keele, which is really state-of-the-art stuff. It cost about $1 billion for the new forensic lab to be built, with all the seals and the safety features to prevent any biocontamination occurring. And so basically I started there, and I was my first job was as a technician. I started repairing breathalyzers. Mm-hmm. So I repaired all the breathalyzers in the province of Ontario for a few years. Then I caught fire. It was an area I wanted to be, so I went and got my 4-year degree, which is a minimum requirement. Did lecturing on the breathalyzer courses, wrote some scientific paper, did research, got promoted, and eventually became a senior scientist. And for forensic toxicology, you spend a lot of time in court because impaired driving cases are quite numerous. Are
there any that really are kind of memorable? Like maybe they were a little bit more interesting than others, or unusual, or any that were in the media, or? Well,
there's been a few, especially if there was deaths. There's been a few that have been in the media. My last big case was the Ramage case, where he was it was a former Toronto Maple Leaf captain, Rob Ramage, who was involved in a car accident and killed the person in his car. I did the blood analysis and urine analysis for alcohol, and there was very high alcohol levels. The hospital also did alcohol analysis, and it was they all agreed they're all very high alcohol levels. The lawyer was Brian Greenspan, who's one of the top Canadian lawyers. So it was a bit stressful that way. He's a superb lawyer, and it was in front of a jury, too, which adds another thing, because again, that's the interesting thing about forensic science is no matter what a brilliant scientist you are or how many papers you publish, if you can't explain your finding to the jury, it's useless.
So you have to kind of explain it in basic English so they understand.
Because if they don't understand it, they'll have no idea what you're talking about. They may acquit or they may get confused with the science. So it's always important to to address it to the person and to try to simplify a complicated area sometimes. So, yeah, that was a trial. He was eventually, it was quite stressful with Brian Greenspan. Again, he was a superb lawyer. He brought all sorts of books out to cross-examine my expertise. But in the end, the jury convicted on all charges.
So justice, I guess, was done.
Well, yeah, according to the scientific aspects, he was guilty, and then the jury decided he was guilty legally. I determined the scientific aspects, but there's all sorts of many a slip between the lip and the plate that can occur. The science could be strong, but if for some reason, say, the blood sample at the hospital was not taken properly and was violated the person's rights, that sample wouldn't get in. So no matter what my science would say, it would not be admitted into a legal situation, and therefore the case could be lost.
So all the technicalities do make a difference sometimes.
That's right, yeah.
So now that you're retired, do you still testify in court cases? Do you still have some that you...
Yes, what I've done is criminal court is very intense and a lot of work, and you travel around the province quite extensively. So I sort of want to retire a bit for the criminal court, so I still do civil cases. So, and I find civil cases, you don't have to testify as many times. It's usually settled by reports. And a civil case, as opposed to a criminal case, a civil case would be a case where, say, a person's at a bar and the bar overserves a person. They give him lots and lots of alcohol, and he gets in his car and he kills someone or injures someone. So basically, the lawyers on that will go after the bar's insurance. Mm-hmm. So all the bars have to have insurance. And if they're found that they were over-serving and contributed to the accident by not cutting the person off, then there can be settlements done, usually outside of court. But occasionally you will go to a jury, and they'll determine who's responsible for what and what percentage. So basically what I would do is I would calculate how much the person would have to drink. Mm-hmm. So he'd have a certain alcohol level, whether determined by the breathalyzer or a blood sample. And the bar may say, well, we only gave him 2 beers, or a typical type of 2-beer defense, not just even civilly, but also criminally. So I only had 2 beers. So I would estimate how much he would have to drink. So I would have to estimate that at the bar he had from 10 to 15 bottles of beer, which tends to go more for over-serving than just saying they only had 2 bottles of beer.
Yeah. Okay, so what else do you do in your retirement? You do lectures or something as well?
Oh, yes. I've done all sorts of lectures. And basically, as you know, I've been doing a lot of research on the books and publishing more papers. I've lectured now mainly on cannabis because it's a new drug to Canada. And there's a lot of misinformation and lack of knowledge about the drug. So what I did is I created a series of lectures entitled Not Your Granddad's Weed, the Forensic Science of Cannabis. And I lectured at various public libraries across Toronto. The Toronto Public Library system is superb. They have 100 branches. They really assist you, and they have great lecture halls. And so I would go to the various branches and talk to people about cannabis, what the difference between cannabis and alcohol is, what are the different types of this drug. And I found it quite fascinating. The people were very interested in the drug and wanted to know a lot about. And actually, their input helped me with my book that I published on Wigmore on cannabis.
Well, we'll get to the books shortly after, a little bit later. First of all, I wanted to let the people know that if you want to hear Jim talk on both the areas of forensics he's involved in, look on the Toronto Public Library's website and just do a search for his name, James Wigmore, and cannabis, or James Wigmore and alcohol, and just see what library pops up. To get back to the alcohol, because this happened this year in the spring, you went to South Africa, Johannesburg, and you attended the first African Forensic Toxicology Conference then as a speaker? Yes,
I was. For alcohol and forensic aspects of alcohol, we're quite advanced in Ontario and in Canada. We have our laws have been evolved since 1969, so we've been quite up with things and very knowledgeable. And my book, Wigmore and Alcohol, had been published for a few years then. So based in South Africa, they were having a bit of problems with alcohol. especially the forensic area. So they invited me as a guest speaker to help. Part of the problem is they for a while hadn't done breath testing. Oh. Now, by doing breath alcohol testing, you can do a lot more people more rapidly. You don't have to have the problems about taking a blood sample. Especially, you may injure the person taking the blood sample, or you may have some biohazard that occurs. You don't have to worry about once you take the blood sample, who does it go to, how is it refrigerated, how is it sealed, who does the analysis, how is it received the lab. With breath testing, very simple. You blow into the instrument directly and you get the results right away. So the police know immediately what to charge a person with, whether it's over 80 milligrams, which is our limit, or whatever. So I was basically was there to help them and give them on some advice about the scientific aspects. The legal aspects, of course, depends on the country. So they're now back into doing breath alcohol testing rather than just blood samples, and the prosecutors are getting a bit better at the prosecution. Same thing, and also with the police. For a while there, it seemed to be not a serious offense. Even though they have a large number of deaths in South Africa due to driving and drinking driving especially, it didn't seem to be, they seemed to have a lot of problems in court getting convictions. So there was the deterrent effect was not as good.
Did you mentioned something, I think we were talking before the show, about a cultural problem too, with an attitude towards drinking and driving?
Yes, an attitude towards drinking. Again, part of the problems is that you can basically get alcohol 24/7 in parts of South Africa, and they don't really follow the legal limit. So you have young children or younger teens who are drinking, and the earlier you drink or the earlier you take any drug, the worse the consequences are. There's much more problems of addiction, more problems of impaired driving, and other aspects. So they do have a bit of a cultural problem where drinking is somewhat glorified.
Okay, you mentioned also just a few minutes ago about Ontario and everything were more, and other provinces were more advanced in it. Just, I don't know if there are any statistics out there, or if there are any, give me a ballpark figure of the number of people who are charged with drinking and driving, or who are. You said there's a lot of it going on in South Africa, but then they weren't charged for a while. They didn't go to court and didn't go through the courts properly. But based on Ontario's rates, and are there any similarities, or are they way off the map as far as being the same or different than each other?
Yeah, they're way off the map. I think the fatality rates for driving is like 5 or 6 times at least for Ontario, the per capita rate, and so they do have a serious problem. And also the other interesting thing is that most of the people who are killed in South African driving accidents are pedestrians, whereas in Ontario and most of the other, like United States and Canada, most of the people who are killed in driving accidents are drivers. Mm. So it shows that there's a lot of pedestrian problems with pedestrian safety, and a lot of jaywalking going on, and the lighting being poor, and people wearing dark clothes at night. So most of the fatalities in South Africa are pedestrians. Yeah,
although it's creeping up in Toronto, although they're not necessarily all drunk drivers that are hitting them. But I was just thinking now the age in this is Ontario now, the age where this most serious, or the most times that the offense is committed driving and while under the influence of alcohol and getting into an accident. The old statistics, and that maybe they're not up to date anymore, were young men, teenager up to maybe late 20s. And I know going back about maybe 2-3 years of that there was that horrific accident in Richmond Hill where part of a whole family was taken out by a drunk driver, and it was 3 kids, all the family's kids, and then the grandfather. And the drunk driver was in his late 20s, and I believe the court case came up last year, and he was convicted, I think.
He pled guilty, yeah.
Yeah. So is that still the norm for the highest amount of it, or is it sort of more mixed now?
It tends to be, it's more mixed. Like when I started years ago, it was maybe 95% male drivers. Mm-hmm. And now it's probably around 75% male drivers, and the rest are women drivers. So the driving among women has crept up. Still not the extent as for men. And it's basically still seems to be the same problems. Young males in their 20s to early 30s is the bulk of the problems. But then you also get alcohol-dependent individuals who are older, say in their 40s or 50s, who have high blood alcohol concentrations and get involved in accidents too.
Yeah.
But it tends to be more of a male problem with a lot of drug problems. It tend to be a male problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's switch over to cannabis now, as its legalization is becoming a part of Canada, and certainly some of the U.S. states have legalized marijuana. So why did you switch your focus from that more so than the alcohol?
Well, it's all basic interest. One of the reasons why I was sort of delighted, because I was basically focusing on alcohol because that's our main thing in court. But cannabis use is creeping up, so there's actually more and more cannabis use. But what sort of twigged me over is that the active drug or the active ingredient of cannabis is tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. And what that is an alcohol. Most people don't know that it is an alcohol. So with alcoholic beverages, the alcohol is ethanol, or an alcohol base is its name, which causes the impairment. With cannabis, there's all sorts of cannabinoids, but the drug that causes the impairment and all the problems is tetrahydrocannabinol. When it has an OL ending on the end, it means it's an alcohol. So it's basically another alcohol. So alcohol in alcoholic beverages is a simple alcohol. It's only 2 carbons. It's water soluble. For the alcohol of THC, it's 21 carbons. So it's a lot of carbons in its structure, and it's fat soluble. So it has a whole bunch of different features to it than a water-soluble simple drug like alcohol and alcoholic beverages. But I was just fascinated by it, so I just dug into more and more research into it, and finally published the book.
Okay, that brings up another question about when you mentioned the contents of cannabis. And you say not your grandfather's weed. This is going back in the day when we were, late 60s, 70s, when, people would smoke weed. So they'd smoke it to get high, period. But nowadays, they do other things. They use it other ways, and there's a lot of dangers in there. Do you want to elaborate a little bit about that?
Yes. It's quite fascinating if you look at the history. Probably weed in the 1960s and 70s was a relatively safe drug. Actually, a lot of studies back then, the Ledane Commission, and even a lot of American studies said it's a relatively safe drug. It's probably no more dangerous than alcohol, and perhaps maybe even better. But the problem, what has happened is the cannabis in the 60s and 70s only contained about 1 to 3% THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, the active drug. And so it also contained another cannabinoid called CBD, cannabidiol, CBD. And back in the 60s and 70s, the marijuana smoked then had low THC, 1 to 3%, and high CBD. Now, the CBD moderates the effects of the THC. It makes it less psychotic, less problems of having bad trips or bad experiences. And so basically it was relatively mild. But what has happened since then is people are much more professional at growing the plants. I mean, back in the old days, you just have a field and grow the plants willy-nilly, and you get the low yield. But what it is done nowadays, done in controlled indoor conditions, greenhouse conditions, which try to get the most THC possible to get the greatest yield. And the other difference is that the cannabis plant, an interesting plant, it's a wonderful plant in some ways, has both male and female plants. It's one about only 5% of the plants in the world that have separate male and female. So the cannabis plant has the male plant and the female plant. And what they found over the period of time is that it's the female plant that produces a lot of the THC, not the male. And also the female plant will produce the cannabinoids and THC if it's not fertilized. So what is done is if you do have any male cannabis plants, they're ripped out right away before they can produce pollen. Because if you just have all female plants without being fertilized, they produce more and more THC. Because what they're doing is they're trying to protect their flowers. And basically the cannabinoids and the other compounds in the plant basically are used to insect repellent and to prevent animals from eating it. So basically, the female plant grows and grows. If it's not fertilized, produces more and more of the protective compound, and then eventually it can be harvested. And the yields can go from 1 to 3% with having the mixed plants to about 30% THC. So about 10 times the dose now than it was in the old 60s and 70s. So it's quite a change. And the marijuana has changed its name too. It's now called sinsemilla, and that's Spanish for without seeds, because it's grown just having female plants, not fertilized, not producing any seed. Because once the female plant produces seeds, the THC yield goes way down again. So again, in the old days, in the 60s and 70s, they didn't know about this. And, they would actually, I've seen people smoking with the seeds. The seeds virtually contain no THC. Or the same thing with the leaves and the stems. They don't contain as much THC. But the buds, the unfertilized flowers, and the tips of the female plant especially contain a large concentration and give a much greater jolt than the old days. I think of it as, when I try to explain to people, I said, in your granddad's time, it's 1% to 3%. And so if you ask your granddad about marijuana back then, his advice would be useless for you, because basically it's like someone, when we're talking about alcohol, someone who's only used to drinking bottles of beer. Okay, so bottles of beer is about 4 or 5% alcohol. And with this new cannabis, just like now switching from bottles of beer to bottles of liquor, and saying you don't have to change your drinking at all. It's the same thing. Well, you have to. The alcohol concentration in spirits is 10 times greater than that of beer. Likewise, the THC concentration, the active drug, has 10 times the dose as it had back in the old days of 60s and 70s.
Also, how people use it. They don't just smoke it now. There's
all sorts of new technology to do it. Basically, smoking in joints are still the most popular kind, because it's very clean, very easy to do. You do have bongs and pipes, which have to be cleaned. The main area now is called vaping, and that seems to be more for the medical uses. And what vaping does is it sort of like vaporizes the plant material, the cannabis, at a lower temperature. So it's not combusted. So it's like when you're smoking it from a joint, just like you smoke tobacco, it's burned and oxidized, and you have that strong smell. Vaping is at a lot lower temperature, so it's not burned. And so the smell with vaping is also reduced too for over smoking. I know your predecessor is saying that she doesn't like the smell. That's why she never smoked it. But vaping has a lot less smell than burning it. The other areas that they're using cannabis is edibles, and that is problematic. When the legislation will be introduced and when it's legalized in Canada, it'll only be for the plant material. They will not legalize edibles yet. Edibles will be legalized in another year or so after that. And with edibles, the problems is that you can't titrate the dose. You can't react, because with the cannabis, smoking or vaping it, you feel the effects within minutes. You feel right away. So if it's, say, a type of cannabis like 9-pound hammer or Gorilla Glue or something you're not used to, with the high THC concentration, and you smoke it, you would feel the effect right away. You think, whoa, this is a bit too much. I won't smoke anymore, or I'll, cut back a bit. With edibles, you eat it, and you're sitting there. Dum, 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 dum. Nothing is happening, it seems, because it takes a lot longer for the THC to be absorbed through your stomach. And an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours later, before you feel the effects.
Is that because it's solid?
Well, yes, it's not going through the lungs, and the lungs is the rapid way to get to the brain to cause the effects. Whereas if you're eating it, food always takes longer to absorb through the stomach, and then it gets into the bloodstream, and then it's metabolized by the liver, which produces an active metabolite, which also causes impairment, which may be a problem too with edibles. So edibles has a number of problems. So basically the problem is with people is they take it and they feel no effects, so they take another dose, and so they overdose. And you saw that with the 2 police officers who had I think it was the gummy bears. Mm-hmm. They on duty, actually, allegedly, and the edibles were seized from a dispensary, because edibles currently are still illegal. You're not supposed to sell edibles. And they took the one and they couldn't feel, and then they took another one, they felt the effects. So a lot of the adverse effects I've seen with cannabis, like people falling off buildings or becoming psychotic, and perhaps shooting at the police and things like that have been to do with overdosing in edibles. People not understanding. They'll have they're like one I remember. It was a cookie that said only eat 1/6 of this cookie. Like it wasn't properly legislated, which is what you'll have to do. Rather than having a dose saying, this is the standard dose, they said eat 1/6 of the cookie. So the person ate a 1/6 of the cookie, and then he didn't feel the effect, and he ate more and more. And he, rather than having 10 milligrams of THC, he induced 60 milligrams. Ooh. And it caused him either to fall or to commit suicide off the building, and he died. And that was edibles again, misuse of edibles.
So I guess maybe the rule of thumb should be don't treat the edibles like chocolate.
Exactly right. Yes. Yeah.
So because you don't want to be an edible-aholic.
And also be patient. Don't take an edible and then expect the effects to be right away. And if it doesn't happen, then you've got to have more. Yeah, just be very cautious on them. And again, they're not legal because again, part of the problem is you can't titrate it. With an edible you eat, you have no idea the strength and concentration or how fast it will be absorbed. So it's very, very variable in comparison to smoking or vaping.
Okay, for the legalized cannabis, then how is the Ontario government selling it, or how will they? It's going to go through the government.
Yes.
And what exactly are people going to purchase, and how can they purchase it?
Well, currently, although it may change now that we have a new premier, but because that's all legislated by the government. Currently, I think it was a maximum of 40 places that would sell it, and it would sell it separate from alcohol. You got to separate the two. That's one. If any message people get across is to separate the two drugs. Never consume alcohol together with cannabis, because the two drugs combine to make greater impairment and have all sorts of other problems. And also, you can become addicted to both, and it's hard to get rid of your addiction if you're addicted to both drugs. So always make a rule of thumb: do not drink if you're using cannabis, or do not use cannabis when you're drinking. So separate the two. So the Ontario government is just selling cannabis separately in a store away from the liquor store.
So that's all for recreational purposes?
That's right, for recreational purposes. Yeah, for medical purposes, you can still get it through the mail, which is currently the only way you can get cannabis legally is through the mail.
And is that going to change? Or?
That supposedly won't be changing, but then they'll have the recreational cannabis available in the stores. They're going to have it where it's not going to be, splashed over and advertised. The problem with cannabis will not be the legalization, but will be the commercialization. Because there's a lot of big business wants to make a lot of money. So, of course, the way you make a lot of money is by selling a lot of the drug, whether it be alcohol, tobacco, cigarettes, or cannabis. And so cannabis is just another way for them to do it. So if a lot of commercialization is allowed, where they have, big gummy bears, to try to sort of encourage kids like they did with tobacco and Joe Camel. I'm waiting for Joe Cannabis to start appearing.
God, we hope not.
I hope not. And again, the whole problem with the cannabis use will be with the commercialization and control of it. And like it's taken us 50 years, basically control tobacco. And hopefully it won't take us as long for cannabis. We've learned our lesson. And just have it sold to responsible adults using it responsibly.
Is the age the same then?
Yes, it'll be for 19 years of age, the same for alcohol.
Okay, so if somebody is smoking weed or vaping or doing something with it, hopefully not eating it, and they get behind the wheel of a car, how are the police going to be able to determine if they can't blow for that?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, you can't. The concentration of cannabis in the blood is measured in nanograms or billionth of a gram. So it's about 1 million times less concentration than alcohol. Alcohol, we do breath tests. You can do it on the road right away, no problem. They're accurate, they're reliable. They are extremely valuable in controlling the drinking driving problem. With cannabis, we can't measure THC currently in the breath. So basically, we can't. We don't have breath testing for cannabis or cannibalizers or whatever. So what they will have to do is that the police will have some physical tests to look at. With the THC, especially when you use it recently, you'll have red bloodshot eyes. Your heart rate is basically almost doubles depending on the dose of cannabis. So they'll be looking for a number of features. So it'll be a bit of a swaying of the person, the individual. So when they do what they call the standardized field sobriety test, there'll be signs of impairment that they'll find. Once they've done that, that gives them ground to perhaps do an oral fluid test. So that's what the police will be tending towards for screening is oral fluid. So what it is just putting a color change device in your mouth. Mm-hmm. It'll collect the oral fluid, and you'll see a color change depending on how much THC is involved in your oral fluid, which means what is in your bloodstream. So oral fluid will be a good screening technique to check for cannabis, but also THC, but also about 5 other drugs. They can also do amphetamine and other drugs. So they can do a multiple number of drugs. If they fail the screening test of oral fluids, then they would get a blood sample. And the blood sample would then be submitted to the lab to do their detailed and accurate analysis for drugs.
So would this first test be done like when they stop you at your car, like the blowing is now for the alcohol, or would all this be hauled into the police station and do it at the police station?
No, it would be at the roadside. Especially the standardized field sobriety tests can be done at the side of the road.
Okay.
And what they would do is normally you do a breath test anyways, like, because red eyes
could be booze.
They typically think it's alcohol. So what you would do is you'd blow on the breath test, and if you blow 0 and you have all this impairment, then they suspect another drug. Most likely it's cannabis or THC, and so they would do the standardized field sobriety test, and then do more detailed testing and narrow it down. But if they get a high alcohol level, they won't worry about cannabis. I mean, they're
going to get you on the other.
They're going to get you on one, if
not the other. Yeah, I see. Okay, let us talk about your new book now, Wigmore on
cannabis. Yep.
So, and then hold up the other one too, Wigmore on alcohol. The first one. These are both for professionals in the medical and legal field.
Well, they're designed. Well, basically, they're designed for the medical and legal field, but also I wrote them to sort of like that the layperson can understand.
That's what I was wondering.
Very useful because again, it's in my field. It's no good, writing airy fairy books or ivory tower if the layperson can't understand it, and that's what I found with my lecturing to lay people. I think you understand it better if you can lecture to lay people and they can understand it too. But so basically it's basically designed a number of chapters. It's mainly for a legal purpose. So it talks about oral fluid, how to do the tests. It talks about the standardized field sobriety tests. It talks about drug recognition. It talks about the effects of cannabis on things like memory, pedestrians, sexual assaults, and homicides, the effects of that. So it's quite good. I learned a lot when I did it. The interesting thing, which the audience may do to explain cannabis a bit too, is you can see the book is not doesn't show the typical cannabis leaf. Like you see a lot of cannabis books that show you the marijuana leaf. Yeah. And that seems to be the worldwide recognition. But the marijuana leaf contains very little THC. Where the THC comes from is from these little hairy, hairs coming from the female plant called trichomes. And you can see their little white dots all the way over here. Dots. And again, that's all over the plant. There's the flowers here, or the unfertilized flowers.
And what's the red we see down?
That's the red is, red and orange is part of the pistils trying to get the pollen. So they keep growing and try to get the fertilized. And of course, if you don't have any male cannabis plants, you won't get fertilization and you get THC. So basically, the female plant produces all these trichomes to protect the flowers, and the trichomes have a high THC concentration. And so basically what I did with my book is rather than having the innocuous universal leaf, we have actually where the cannabis mainly comes from, which is the trichomes in the female plant.
So that's more of an accurate picture?
Yeah.
Okay, so it was interesting the part you mentioned were about memory loss and all that part. Yeah. That would be maybe what would interest the lay person.
That's right, yeah. There's stuff that would interest the lay person. Also, there's stuff that would interest the lawyer or the police officer, because this is all a new area. So although we have alcohol down pat, and we know the proper techniques and procedures of dealing with alcohol-impaired drivers. Cannabis-impaired drivers is going to be more complicated and more problematic.
Yeah. So where is your book available if people want to buy a copy?
Book's available on from Irwin Law at www.irwinlaw.com. If you just Google Wigmore and cannabis, it'll show you. Maybe Google where to buy Wigmore and cannabis. Sometimes it's picked up by all sorts of other booksellers.
Okay, because I was just wondering if you can get it through. I mean, everybody's goes to Amazon first, unless they.
It may be. I'm not sure. It's only been out recently, so it may not be available on Amazon yet.
Yeah.
But just Google where to buy Wigmore on cannabis or Wigmore and alcohol, and it'll tell you. Wigmore and alcohol is much more available because it's been around for 5 or 6 years.
So, are either of them available, or will they be available in e-copies as well, or?
Oh yes, my publisher has e-copies of both books. Yeah.
So if anybody wants that, yeah, well, they probably will be able to get it at some place like Amazon where they can get an e-copy.
Perhaps, yeah.
Perhaps at some point in time.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think I think that they're very good books because it's something that people, even if they're not a medical professional or a lawyer or a police officer, there's information there that the layperson should I think know.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
And also, I found it very fascinating. I mean, I have a little bit of the history and the difference, especially with the cannabis book, I compared it to alcohol. So, like I said, both alcohol and tetrahydrocannabinol alcohols, they're both eliminated by the liver. They both cause the red bloodshot eyes, they cause driving impairment, they cause memory loss, and they eventually can cause unconsciousness. So the drugs have a lot of similar effects to each other.
Yeah. So the alcohol one, I know there's some interesting cases in there.
Yes.
Do you have some also in the cannabis?
Yes, I have case reports of people involving in interesting situations. The case reports I find are very interesting, illustrating eventual problems. There was one where it was a woman introduced to hospital with psychosis, delusions of grandeur, all sorts of problems. And what it was from eating chocolate edibles, cannabis infused chocolates every day.
Double whammy.
And so what happened is she was building up her THC level because their body didn't have enough time to get rid of it. So she was eating more and more of the chocolate. I don't think she gained any weight, but she ate more and more of the chocolate and then caused a psychosis. And psychosis, basically caused by THC, is sort of like a mental disorder that causes loss of touch of reality. So you have delusions, you have hallucinations, you have paranoia, you have disorganized thinking. You're not thinking, and you have disorganized talking, things like that. So that's psychosis. So she had delusions of grammar and psychosis. So basically what they did is just cut the THC from her. And after about a week or so, she was fine. And they advised her not to use cannabis again. She says, well, no, it's medically prescribed, so it can't cause any problems. And again, I think that's a problem that people have, is they think cannabis is a much safer drug than alcohol. It's not really. It's a different drug than alcohol.
Well, isn't it somewhat regulated in dosage if you're taking it for medical reasons? Like you take so much, as opposed like if you're taking a prescription pill, there's a dosage you take.
Yes, there should be, but basically what the medical cannabis is basically taken by either smoking it as a joint or by vaping it. That's the main thing. There are prescriptions you can get for synthetic THC, but they don't seem to be as popular as the real stuff. I think what the problem is the crossover between medical and recreational use. Like in Colorado, when they switched from just strictly medical to recreational, the number of people using it for medical purposes decreased by 90%. So a lot of people are using the medical thing to get it recreationally, to get another thing. But the same thing happened. I mean, that's another comparison. Both alcohol and cannabis had prohibitions against them and all sorts of exaggerated fears against their use. So to break prohibition in the U.S., alcohol was prescribed medically. So there was hundreds of thousands of prescriptions written for alcohol. And it's not really that great for medical purposes. But it was done for people still to get around. The same thing for cannabis. Because of prohibition, and probably unfair prohibition and a bit too strict, people are trying to get around it by saying that it's for medical uses. So both drugs broke prohibition by allowing medical prescriptions.
So history always repeats itself, it seems.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, if there was one thing you would want to tell people to be, if they're going to use cannabis, what's just one thing they need to watch out for? What is the most important thing, or maybe the two most important things?
Well, basically the effects, whether it's good or ill effects of cannabis, depend on dose, setting, and set, basically. So dose means the concentration of THC. So especially if you're starting using cannabis, go low and go slow, as they say. Mm-hmm. So basically, in the stores where you can buy cannabis, they'll list what the THC concentration is and what the CBD concentration is. So what you would do if you're a new user, go for low THC. So rather than 15, 20, 30%, which is pretty strong, go for like 5% or 5 to 8%, something like that. And then also go for CBD being high, because CBD will counteract the effects of THC. So go for low THC, high CBD. So that's the dose. The set is basically what the genetics you have. Like some people genetically will have an adverse reaction no matter what happens with cannabis. Mm. So of course it shouldn't be using. Just like some people have an adverse reaction to alcohol. It's just their genetics. The other thing that will affect your impairment in that and the adverse effects of the drug will be on your use. So if you're more used to the drug, you'll have more of a tolerance to it and can tolerate it. It will not have as a bad effect as if you're a new user. And the other thing which is very important is setting. So basically cannabis or THC tends to amplify the setting. So if you're in a nice quiet environment and you take it and you're with friends, you're less likely to become paranoid and psychotic than you are, say, in a party situation or in a situation where there's a lot of strangers where you don't know. There's one classical one which just happened just recently. It was on the Delta Air flights. It was a person, and it was edible cannabis, a person who used to eat gummy bears to help him go to sleep. And that's fine. So he was in a quiet room and he's using the gummy bears, and he went to sleep and it helped him. So, no big deal. But what he decided to do is that he was nervous about flying. So he decided he would take these gummy bears on the plane before he entered the plane. So he took a couple of gummy bears, and rather than calming them down, with all the strangers in there and having the closed environment and all the pressure in that, he got very paranoid and got very aggressive, and he tried to open the door mid-flight. They had to subdue him. It was quite a scene. He was charged, and he eventually got 2 years in jail for threatening an airline like that. So, again, be aware about, when you take it at home, you may have a nice, pleasant effect. But if you take it, say, outside at some place where it's very, strangers and that, you may have a worse effect.
So don't take it in airports or on airplanes.
That's right, or any public places, basically, where there's strangers around, because you can develop paranoia and start thinking they're talking about you, and there may be terrorists or something. So.
Okay, and there's a federal government page that you sent me, federal government page called Your Cannabis Questions Answered, and it's got more information about it. And there's a police officer there, and there's a lawyer, and there's a psychiatrist, I think. And you're on there for experts.
That's right.
So people can just go to that and
there's questions are asked. What we did, well, Health Canada did, which was very good, is they had focus groups, and they found out what questions Canadians were interested in. So we had filming done, or shoots done, at the Young Eglinton Centre and at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Montreal, where they had people from the outside come in and ask questions. And we had a team of 10 experts, as you indicated. It's great. They had a wide variety. I was a forensic toxicologist, the only one there. They had some psychiatrists. They had some public drug policy people. They had the police officers, which are very good, and so we could all answer the questions our own way. And I found it very useful, and I thought they finally have it released now on YouTube and also on their website. So there's a lot of good questions, a lot of good answers about cannabis.
Well, that's good to know. Well, I think we have to wrap it up now. So you want to hold your books up?
Okay, yeah.
I want to thank you, Jim, for coming here. James Wigmore, and his books are Wigmore on Alcohol and Wigmore on Cannabis. And if you go to the Urban Law site, you can find out where they are available, or just Google Jim's name. And Dana insists I have to list my books here, Beyond Faith and Beyond Blood by Sharon A. Crawford. And this is the end of our first segment for Crime Beat Confidential. And we'll be coming with more guests sometime in the near future. Thank you very much.